Today is Martin Luther King Jr. Day in the United States, and if Dr. King taught us anything, it's that change can happen. And so a lot of what we've tried to do here today is talk about change. One of the instructions we gave to the speakers was said, and everybody enjoys getting our indignation excited about the bad things that some of our colleagues do, and that's good fun, and it needs to be pointed out. So please go ahead and have at it and have fun. But we can't stop there. We need to go beyond saying, look at these problems we have with various biases and poor behaviors in research, and we need to start to talk about the solution. And so we're going to try to focus a little bit on that in the discussion. Here's my disclosure. I'll make my slides available with my email address. If anybody wants my slides, just email me and you can read my disclosure. Historical context. So one of the things that we hear a lot is, oh, it's really bad today and it's gotten worse. And there are certain things, like, for example, there are more retractions. But exactly what that means is not clear. Does that mean that in fact we have more bad science than we used to relative to the total amount of science? Or that we've gotten better at detecting it and we have higher standards now? And I don't think we know. My own intuition is that actually things are better than they've ever been. That these problems in science, whether it's vitriolic attacks, whether it's lack of civility among scientists, whether it's fraudulent data, is not new, and it was probably worse historically than it is today. And here are just some famous examples. It's quite clear at this point that Brother Gregor Mendel fudged his data. The likelihood that he would have, for example, got 7 genes on 7 independent chromosomes that to get his second law of independent assortment, independent segregation, by chance alone is effectively 0. His Punnett squares are too good, they're too close to the actual expected frequencies, and this has been shown many times, and so clearly he massaged the data a little bit. There's evidence that Louis Pasteur massaged his data a little bit, Sir Cyril Burt, that findings have been suppressed when Dominique Cassini had what essentially we would call today a postdoc, Ole Romer, who said, I think the speed of light is finite, and I think that that moon is going to come around that planet 4 minutes later than you think. And he was exactly right, and it was evidence that in fact the speed of light was finite. People after it came out said, oh, we never said it was going to come out at exactly that time, you changed it. So it's like, they didn't have pre-registration of what the analysis was. Leopold Kronecker tried to suppress Cantor's work on infinities. Sir Isaac Newton and Leibniz accused each other of stealing ideas about the development of the calculus. And in fact, it wasn't all open and it wasn't all friend sharing. Isaac Newton often didn't like to publish his papers. He thought he was a professor. He got money from the university. It was his job to explore knowledge, not to share it with anybody necessarily. And you can see here when he does realize he's got the calculus, he writes in a letter to somebody. He says, because I cannot proceed with the explanation of it now, I prefer to conceal it thus. And he gives a little code. And then this code, he's got a cipher which translates it back to the essence of the calculus. So really things weren't so much better in the past. How many of you know this classic study? This is by Vickery, 1957. And it's this neat study showing that quickly flashing subliminal messages in New Jersey movie theater. And what was done, it was told that he flashed the message so fast people couldn't consciously see it. It said, hungry, eat popcorn. And this increased popcorn sales by 57.5%. And then he flashed, drink Coca-Cola, and it increased Coca-Cola sales by 18.1%. Everybody's probably heard of these kinds of studies, right? And it's a sort of neat classic study, except it never happened. The study doesn't exist. And it was a publicity myth. And he just basically lied. He just totally invented the study. The study was never done, and it was later found out. But he used this to advance his career in advertising. And so these are not new phenomena. In fact, they may have even been more blatant in the past. There is a psychological context to this as well. This is another classic experiment showing a kind of bias. And I show this to point out that biases can exist. Biases do exist. They exist for all of us as a function of being humans. The only humans that don't have interests are those that don't get out of bed in the morning. The catatonic has no interests. The rest of us who get out of bed have interests. And once you have interests, you have conflicts of interest. And they don't have to be financial. So here's this kind of neat study that Robert Rosenthal and Kermit Foe did in 1963. And what they found was they went to their psychology class and they said to the students, we'd like you to replicate this study that's already been done. And we have one strain of rats that's been bred to be really smart at going through mazes. And we have another strain of rats that have been selectively bred for being very dull at learning to go through mazes. And we will give, you guys are getting the smart rats and you guys are getting the dull rats. And it was, of course, there were no smart and dull rats, it was all just randomly assigned rats. And then they let the students do the experiments. And what you got here is this is the number of correct responses in a maze of the rats that were labeled bright, and this is the one that were labeled dull. And it was significant at the 0.01 level. And so this is this very classic study showing how experimenter expectancies can lead to results even when there should be no results. This later led to Pygmalion in the classroom, when Rosenthal and others showed that in fact they could get results very much like this with children instead of rats, and school teachers instead of psychology students, showing that if they told the school teachers these were the bright kids or the dull kids, the bright kids perform better and the dull kids perform worse. So this really suggests that there are all kinds of biases we need to take into account. But I also have to be clear that in fact, people argue whether this study can be replicated. So here's a 1980 paper which tried to replicate this study, and they could not do that. So who knows? But the point is that there are biases present, and that these biases need to be controlled for, and we need to find ways as scientists to control for them. Merely pointing out that somebody has a potential bias, and certainly pointing out only on the basis that they have a financial connection, is meaningless. To tell me that somebody has conflicts of interest is to tell me that the sun rose this morning. I already know this. What are we going to do about biases and interests? So what are some of the challenges and what are some of the potential solutions? I'm going to go through this rather quickly because I think you've already heard quite a lot about it. We can have things that distort language. I won't give the details here, it's published, but as Denny said, many people use causal language when they really only found an association. What can be done about it? Oh, I'm sorry, and another thing is there's a lot of spin. This is from a sort of paper that came out in Science, a sort of commentary news piece in Science on the power of negative thinking and how people sort of spin negative results and bury negative results. And this was from a paper in AJCN, and it was interesting. They cite us as pointing this out and show that another paper published in AJCN, the senior author of one agreed that the abstract overstated the case, suggesting that swapping water, diet drinks with heavy calorie beverages caused weight loss when that outcome was not statistically significant. I love this part. He blamed the journal, AJCN, for the sentence. The journal process is imperfect, he told Science. That's what the editors wanted to put there. So Denny Beer made me do it. Denny Beer says, I agree that the change had been urged by the journal, but only because the original version overstated the results to an even greater degree. So we need to find ways to sort of try to keep the spin under control. Here's one way that people have tried. This is a statement from editors of the Heart Group journals, where they said, if you do this type of study, you can use this type of language. If you do this type of study, you can do use this type of language. And I think that's if we can get the journals to start adopting this as a standard, and then try to give support to the reviewers and editors to monitor that adoption, I think we'll be better off. Press releases can be distorted. Here's a good example. Here's a journal article. Our study is limited as an observational study, and therefore causality cannot be inferred. Here's a reference. A very reasonable, tempered statement by these authors. Here's the press release from the author's institution. Low vitamin D levels pose large threat to health. Researchers, a 26% increased risk of death. Researchers at Johns Hopkins are reporting what is believed to be the most conclusive evidence to date that inadequate levels of vitamin D obtained from milk fortified cereals and exposure to sunlight lead to substantially increased risk of death. What happened to causality cannot be inferred. I guess it cannot only be inferred in peer-reviewed journals. So what might we do about this is we might perhaps have press releases be peer-reviewed. How about having a little box you can check as an author after your paper is accepted, which says, I'm willing to pay another $250 publication fee in order for you to have the peer reviewers read my university's press release and work on revising it until they say it means what the study really means. And then I get a little seal of approval, and then that journalist knows whether my press release was peer reviewed. Analytic fiddling, we've heard a lot about that today, all the different ways you can sort of manipulate the data by analyzing it over and over. Denny did a great job of it. This is a complicated slide pointing out how you can detect it, but I won't go into it at this time. What might you do? Well, I think Kevin's pointed out the best example is get the raw data out there. As Andrew said, let's register the trials first, or the studies, whether they're trials or not. Pre-specify the analyses. Now we know what was and wasn't pre-specified. And then, as Kevin said, let's get the raw data deposited so you can say anybody can go in and check. If you're not confident in the analyses that the author did, go check it yourself. We can only do that when the raw data are available. Publication bias. This occurs when we tend to publish the results we like more often than we publish the results we don't like. And there's ample evidence that this happens. I won't go into the evidence. What can we do about it? Well, one of the things is that I think for all the research done at nonprofit institutions, we ought to say, you know what, the reason you have your nonprofit institution status is because you have a mission in the public good. That mission is advancing knowledge. In order for you to maintain your nonprofit status, you've got to fulfill your mission. And your mission is not burying the data. Your mission is getting it out there. I also think that when you expose human subjects to risks or discomfort, you have to get an informed consent from them. You have to get IRB approval. And in that informed consent, you've got to say to that subject, why should they participate? And we virtually always put in that informed consent. You're helping to advance knowledge. Well, then I think we have an ethical obligation to follow through and get that knowledge out there. And I think the same thing goes with animal subjects. One of the justifications for using animal subjects and potentially exposing them to harm and pain is that it serves the greater good. It serves the greater good by advancing knowledge. So I think we need to say, if you justified using those animals on the basis of advancing knowledge, you've got to get that knowledge out there. And so I think we need to say, publishing, at least for people at nonprofit institutions, should not be an option. When you do a study, it should be an ethical mandate to publish it at the end. And you might say, well, but it's boring and it doesn't advance my career to publish trivial, uninteresting findings. And that's probably true. It doesn't have to be published in Science. It can be as simple as putting in the F1000 database that Andrew talked about and not worrying about whether it goes through all the steps, at least it's out there. Or even put a technical report on your own university's website, but at least it's out there and it's publicly available. Reporting bias. So, as Denny said, we can now monitor this through clinicaltrials.gov and other reporting database, registering databases. Here's one example of what Denny was talking about. Here's a trial, clinicaltrials.gov. Trial is titled The Effect of Carbonated Soft Drinks on Body Weight. The primary outcome measures, this is according to the authors who registered. The first one listed is body weight, and then a few others listed. Here's the paper published in AJCN. The title of the paper is Sucrose-Sweetened Beverages Increase Fat Storage in the Liver, Muscle, and Visceral Fat Depot, a 6-month randomized intervention study. We're having a body weight. Now you go to the methods. Our main aim, that's their words, was to test the hypothesis that sucrose-sweetened cola increases ectopic fat, blah, blah, blah. What happened to body weight? And so it's not that this is not true, it's just that it distorts what the original intent of this was. You might read this very differently if the title said, a study designed to look at differences in body weight found no effect, but we did find an effect on liver, muscle, and so on. You might read that very differently. You have to go all the way to the results section to find there were no significant differences in the change in body weight or total fat mass. Okay. Proposed solution to reporting bias. We need better standards in the conduct of research training. We need to promote the use of study registration, including the analytic plan. It's not enough to just register the trial. Just as Kevin said, it's not enough to enter the data in the database. it's got to be entered with a good enough quality to use. Similarly, we find we go back to clinicaltrials.gov, and there's almost never a description of the analytic plan. It's not required at this point. I think what we need is that the analytic plan be deposited there as well, so you can see what was the original analytic intent. Provide journals with resources to do appropriate checking and give approval seals. Denny and the AJCN do more of this than any other journal I'm personally involved in, and we still can't do enough. It's just too demanding. I often hear peer review is broken. I don't really think peer review is broken. I think people just want more from it than it can give. Peer review is a way of giving the authors some insights, some feedback from experts in the field. We cannot expect volunteer experts in the field to systematically check where the data are deposited, what the data look like, whether the analyses can be reproduced, whether every citation says what the authors say it says, and so on and so forth. What we need is perhaps more staff that can do some of that, but that's going to cost money. Selective or missed citation. Do papers really show what authors say they show when they cite them later in their own paper? And the answer is not always. We show this in one paper, I won't go through the details, but basically where roughly half of the papers citing another paper incorrectly describe the results that the original paper found in a way that systematically exaggerated them. And you can find that in our paper here in the International Journal of Obesity, 2010. What can we do about that? Well, again, better standards of conduct and research training and building these into our ethical standards, but also, again, providing journals or others with the resources to do appropriate checking and give approval seals. So you can imagine, just as you might pay a little fee and say, I'd like to have my press release peer reviewed and get that seal of approval, maybe I can pay another little fee and have the journal, have a professional librarian or researcher go back and check every time I said a paper said something, did it really say something? And if so, I get that little seal of approval. So in conclusion, what can we do besides wringing our hands and suggesting that woe is us, things are bad, that will plausibly help and accord with our discipline as scientists? Well, I think that there's a lot we can do, and I think ILSI can be a leader in leading by example and helping to pilot test things and helping to promote things. One of the things in training, we can emphasize science as a discipline and a vocation, not a job. And I think people might behave very differently, and Paul Breslin was talking about this at the microphone a little bit yesterday. If they're reminded of their values and if they're asked to sign a pledge. And we actually have empirical evidence that when you ask people before beginning a task to sign a pledge or an honor agreement or read an honor agreement or think about their values, they behave in ways that are more consistent with those values. So Doug Altman and others have recently introduced the idea of a transparency pledge that they want authors to sign before they submit to journals. That's maybe one strategy, and emphasizing that in our culture. We need to develop a set of meta-methods which will collectively buttress and ensure the implementation of the fundamental scientific methods that already exist. These are things like depositing raw data, depositing protocols, depositing manuals of operation, pre-registering trials, so on and so forth, and we need to resource those. And I think we're going to have to bite the financial bullet and put resources into those. I think putting it into the journals may be one of the best ways to do it, not the only way, but one of the best ways. They're obviously gatekeepers who can have some very positive impact, but only if they have more resources than they currently have to implement those meta methods, to do the kind of checking of registrations, of checklists, and so on that we've been talking about. And I think ILSI could do this as a pilot, lead by example. And I think it'd be neat to see ILSI potentially try to do a little pilot work and invest in some of the nutrition journals and give them a little bit of money and say, could you try some of these things out? Could you give some reward program to some of your authors? Let's see how it goes. Let's see if we can start to create a culture where these things are done. And as Jean-Jacques Rousseau said, let's take this path forward. Thank you.